To crosstalk the downing of Flight MH17, I'm joined by my guest, Vladimir Suchan in Cleveland. He is a professor and former Czechoslovak diplomat. In New York, we have Eric Draitser. He is a geopolitical analyst and founder of StopImperialism.org. And here in Moscow, we cross to Eric Kraus. He is an independent political risk analyst. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules, and in fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want. Vladimir, if I can go to you in Cleveland first, John Kerry has a mountain of evidence, he claims, that Russia is directly involved with the downing of this jet in Ukraine, killing 298 civilians. What do you make of his case? Because he reminds everyone he was a prosecutor one time. How well would he do in court?
I think very badly, but in the court of the corporate Western media, he's doing just fine because he knows exactly how to reduce a message to something very simple, if not stupid, and to appeal to the emotional, irrational side of the people, turning the tragedy into a game where he and the West and the White House are trying to whip out outrage, disgust, horror, panic, hate for Russia, and all these things. And if there is some evidence or arguments, these are just stated without actually being delivered. And I too noticed the strange use of the word mountain of evidence, or he also said an enormous amount of evidence. And there is basically none. Interestingly enough, he also repeated or used as would be evidence the so-called leaked tapes by the Kiev regime. And the problem with those tapes is that many people already pointed out that they are clearly frauds and fakes. At the same time, if one even looks into the content of these supposed conversations that were leaked, they are mutually contradictory, inconsistent. The first one pointed or argued that the supposed book battery was based somewhere in Debaltsevo. The second tape put the battery in Donetsk, and then the video with the battery with one missile missing was supposedly in Snezhnoye. And now we know that that battery, which also Kerry used as a would be clear proof of the guilt of the people in Donbass, or even putting himself personally, was actually a Ukrainian battery of book missiles.
Okay, we'll talk about the Ukrainian side of this in a second here, okay? Eric in New York, if I can go to you. I'm listening to the U.S. State Department. It looks like they're using social media as their primary evidence. No photographs, no reconnaissance, no physical evidence. They haven't shown anything to the public yet, but they're so adamant, they're so convinced that they're right. But social media, I mean, this is getting down to Twitter?
Well, absolutely right. And of course, those of us who have been following for the last 3, 4, 5 years, really since social media's explosion onto the mainstream scene, we know that social media is very much under the control of U.S. and Western intelligence, not the least of which we remember what happened in Libya, all of the fake Twitter accounts, all of the fake supposed eyewitness accounts of the alleged strafing of civilians by Gaddafi. We've seen the same with regard to Syria, multiple so-called Twitterers and bloggers, Syrian Danny and others who have been exposed as frauds as well. So it really strains credulity that we would be making a case, or rather the United States establishment would be making a case on such an issue of vital importance from something like social media. But I would also return to the fact that it is not strictly social media. You know, on my subway ride over here to the studio, I happened to catch the cover page, the cover story of the New York Post, one of our local rags here in New York City. And the headline read, "Hey Vlad, why did you kill my son?" Yeah. And it has a picture of some, a father of one of the civilians killed on the plane. Now, think about exactly how that relates to the statements coming out of the State Department and out of the U.S. government. It's really, I think, quite clear that the U.S. media, both mainstream media as well as what we see on social media, is really an appendage of the U.S. political establishment, of the State Department, and the U.S. political elite. And that is a fact that I think is inescapable, and it is a fundamental part of the way in which not only we should understand this issue, but how the narrative is being framed. The narrative is being strained to fit, or rather the facts are being framed to fit a preconceived narrative, as we've seen countless times in recent years.
Eric, in Moscow, if I find it quite striking is that the blame has already been laid, fingers are being pointed, but it looks very clearly to me is that the United States particularly does not really want an investigation, because well, that investigation would probably show something that they don't want to see. And most likely, and I'm not an expert here, I'm going to wait for the investigation, but it seems to me common sense says the Ukrainians did it.
Peter, I don't know who did it, frankly. I claim our expertise in various fields. Aerial warfare is not one of them. One thing we do know is the Americans have extraordinarily good signal intelligence. They're spying on the entire world. They know what you and I had for breakfast today. It defies belief to imagine that they did not have spy satellites over the place where the events occurred, that they did not have over-the-horizon radar watching what was going on. They clearly do have in their possession hard evidence for what brought down the plane. Now, what they're saying, what Mr. Kerry seemed to be saying was, oh, we have excellent evidence, much better than the Russians, but he won't say what it is. If they have this evidence, and it was in their favor, I would imagine it would be all over the pages of the New York Post right now. Oddly, it's just, believe me, we have a mountain of evidence. Well, they had a mountain of evidence on the Iraqi WMD, too. They'd made it up. And I think presumptively, I don't know what brought down the plane, but if they do, they should be telling us, not just saying, trust me. And yes, they are creating this narrative, and yeah.
Go ahead, Eric in New York, jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, everything that Eric said is true, and actually one of the more respected journalists in the United States, Robert Perry, recently published his article really kind of pointing to that very same issue of the fact that the U.S. has all kinds of surveillance, including spy satellites, and where is all of that information? And I would just add one additional point, that we know that NATO, including the United States military forces, were engaged in military drills and exercises in the Black Sea that ended on Thursday, July 17th, the same day that the plane went down. Now, if you're going to tell me that all of those NATO forces from all of those countries, including all of the surveillance that goes along with those exercises, and not one of them picked up the data on the flight, not one of them knew what was in the skies above them, that is absolutely unbelievable and impractical.
Okay, Vladimir in Chicago, in Cleveland, it's very interesting is because really in U.S. media, world media, Anglo-Saxon, they don't want to look at the Ukrainian culpability in all of this. It's just completely blacked out. It's just no one wants to talk about it. And this is a force, an army that does have capabilities.
Well, the Ukrainian army is basically the only one military force in the region on the ground that does have significant real and proven capability to take down the plane. I would like to add to what Eric from New York said. He referred to the military exercises that ended on the very day when MH17 went down. The military exercise is called Sea Breeze or Breeze 2014. And the purpose of the military exercise, with the involvement of some 200 U.S. military specialists, involved electronic warfare and monitoring, purposely and specifically, all commercial traffic in the wide region. In this respect, the only most significant hardcore evidence which we received is at this moment from the briefing by the Russian High Command or the Russian Ministry of Defense from July 21st. And we received all the data, and when that briefing came in, it was almost completely ignored or dismissed by Western leaders and by Western media. And actually, that should have been the bombshell or the game-changing evidence that was brought in. But very much like with the tapes about snipers from Maidan, the first reaction is deafening silence on the part of the West, and then delaying tactic, and instead putting into the media space more and more of the emotional triggers that are supposed to confuse, mislead, and control the narrative.
Eric in New York, I found...
and speaking of the evidence...
No, let me go to Eric because we're going to go to the break real quick here. Eric, in New York, it's very interesting. As I watched that briefing, the Defense Ministry's briefing, it was really quite interesting. It probably could have been presented a little bit better, but it was interesting. Again, just almost completely ignored. Almost like 99% ignored in Western media. Something very, very important.
Absolutely, and if you look at the statements from the State Department, what they said for their reasoning when they were pressed, I believe it was AP's Matthew Lee, one of the only reporters in Washington who's asking any real questions. I believe he pressed the State Department spokesperson to explain why, when Russia had presented all of their evidence and laid it out on the table, why the United States was unwilling to do so. And I believe the answer, and I suppose I'm paraphrasing a little bit, was that there is, quote, no equivalence between Russian surveillance and intelligence and U.S. surveillance and intelligence, whatever exactly that's supposed to mean. And truly, I don't really know what exactly that's supposed to mean. And so again, what we have here is that evidence, data, hard evidence, facts are being presented against rhetoric. And it's the same thing that we saw in Syria with the chemical weapons attack. The United States was on the verge of bombing Syria over a pack of lies and over a pack of rhetorical statements. This cannot be allowed to stand. This is what has to be challenged. This is what I'm challenging, what many of us are challenging. It is the narrative that they're constructing that has to be debunked and exploded.
Eric, real quick in Moscow before we go to the break. 20 seconds.
We are living in a virtual reality. There is synchrony in most of the Western press. I looked at the front page of the Financial Times today, and I was amazed that people could talk about RT being propagandistic. The entire Western mindset is being framed by a very coordinated attempt at propaganda and disinformation.
Eric, let me jump in here. Gentlemen, we have to go to Vladimir in Cleveland. Vladimir, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I never allow conspiracy theorists on my program. But if I look at the timing of this tragedy in Ukraine, the Poroshenko government was, in trouble with its latest offensive in the east. It was losing badly. Soldiers were being encircled. It was really bad news. And all of a sudden, we have this tragedy of killing civilians on this flight. And this puts Ukraine back on the front page. It competes with Gaza. A lot of sympathy, quote unquote, for the Kiev regime. I mean, this is good timing in a way for the coup regime that hasn't been achieving too many successes since February.
Well, the regime did achieve significant successes because Ukrainian oligarchs created a coalition with declared fascists, and through the coup, these fascists took control over the armed forces and police of the Ukrainian state with the resources of 44 million people. And in the last 2 months, the Kiev regime was able to tighten its noose around the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and the latest news are that another 2 towns in the north of the Donetsk People's Republic are now occupied by the Kiev regime as of last night. The other thing besides that is that what we have currently, the timing was very suspicious and very convenient and very good news for the Kiev regime on the propaganda, PR, media level, and also at the political level, because the Kiev regime, the oligarchs and the fascists are now generating a good deal of goodwill and sympathies toward their cause, and it also allows them to cast people who rose against the junta, against the fascists, as terrorists, which was the line or the way in which the Kiev regime was casting them from the very beginning. And so now the Kiev regime tries to present itself as, someone who...
Go ahead,
we
Eric.
come into the question of the way this is being spun in media. You can take, this is the narrative, and you can take the same story and you can spin it 100 different ways. There are hundreds and hundreds of people, perhaps thousands, who have been killed in bombing raids. And the point is that if the plane was brought down by the Ukrainian resistance, by the rebels, they were trying to protect themselves from aerial bombardment by the Kiev regime. I do not know who brought down the plane, but the reason they were shooting into the someone was shooting into the sky was not for fireworks. They were doing it for an attempt at self-protection. Now, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have died in artillery strikes, who have died in aerial bombardment in eastern Ukraine, and those civilians are just as dead as the people who were on the plane. The people on the plane deserve all of our sympathy, but then so do the people on the ground, and we don't get any pretty pictures of just married couples and babies who were killed by the massive onslaught in eastern Ukraine. So apparently they're good dead and they're bad dead, and we only get to see the dead that our media wish for us to see.
Okay, Eric, in New York, one of the things that I'm so troubled about this whole story is that it's getting down, we're getting to the brink here. I mean, the rhetoric coming out of Washington and watching the hysterics in Western media, as you pointed out where you are, what's the next step? I mean, war? Because one thing that seems to me is it's very misunderstood is that they think they can intimidate Vladimir Putin in Russia to back down. That's not going to happen here. And this is what makes it so very dangerous. And I worry when I listen to Western media, the drumbeat to war, we all remember it in 2003, it's happening again.
Absolutely, and it's happening in a far more dangerous situation, in a far more dangerous equation, of course. I mean, it's self-evident why it's so dangerous. And I would return to your question of what next and sort of place this MH17 incident into a broader narrative that is being spun, and that is the narrative of Russian aggression and how this is going to translate. It'll translate in a number of ways. One of the ways that it's happened, and I recently wrote a column about this, that the United States and certain factions within the political establishment in the United States are trying to legislate anti-Russian sentiments, are trying to legislate through the Congress various ways that the United States is going to be able to aggressively posture in a belligerent fashion against Russia. The so-called Russian Aggression Prevention Act of 2014, sponsored by Senator Bob Corker and co-sponsored by John McCain and a slew of other neocons. They have this bill. It is now in committee in the U.S. Senate talking about things like permanently basing U.S. military forces in NATO countries such as Poland, in Romania, in other places, talking about providing not only military support but financial support, political and diplomatic support to Ukraine and to every other country that is willing to have any kind of a confrontation with Russia. Of course, we know Georgia, we know many other places in Eastern Europe where the United States is operating. Now think about what that means. The Russian Aggression Prevention Act. This means that the United States will have legislation on the books, a law that essentially creates a state of war, or darn near a state of war with Russia. Now it is almost unthinkable, and yet this is the reality, and this is what we're facing. And it seems to me here sitting in the United States that there's some kind of a collective hysteria and insanity, not only surrounding this particular incident, but surrounding the entire episode in Ukraine. And my suspicion is it is because the regime change operation from the very beginning, it never went as smoothly as the United States wanted it to. The United States has stumbled and bumbled its way since February 21st through this entire episode, and now they're trying to make up for it.
Yeah, Vladimir in Cleveland, it's a very interesting theory, trying to make up for it, because the myth of Russian expansionism, the myth of Russian aggression, it's all a myth, but you'll never find that in Western media, ever.
We are dealing here with a very good, effective mechanism of projection used by the White House and by the media, because we have reached a point now where so-called NATO expansion is becoming more and more like NATO aggression or aggressive expansion to the gates of Moscow itself. And the bill, which Eric mentioned, indeed, that's a serious stuff. Russian Aggression Prevention Act is basically legislating a state of war with Russia, and now the tragedy with MH17 is trying to sell this very idea as a new global product to all nations around the world, and especially to the Europeans. So it's a very serious fact, and right when the tragedy happened, the Kiev regime asked for several things: for direct presence of NATO troops in Ukraine, then in the last few days, Poroshenko went on record saying that Ukraine would be applying for a status similar to the status of Israel or Japan with respect to NATO and the US, which would turn Ukraine into a significant ally of NATO, officially and for all practical purposes. So what we are now seeing is not just rhetoric and campaign. Yes, that's bad enough. What we see is actually an escalation, and very dangerous escalation of the war and the conflict with clearly anti-Russian direction, ambitions, and goals.
Okay, Eric in Moscow, I can tell you want to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think we need to get hysterical about this. The war used to be carried out with fighter planes and tanks. It no longer is, for the very simple reason that the war would last about 15 minutes. There is not going to be a ground war between Russia and NATO. There is a lot of political posturing. A lot of the things which are included in this legislation are already stuff they're already doing or they're trying to do, and which they cannot do without Europe coming along. And Europe does not need an escalation of hostilities, at least the senior European countries. I think what is much more significant here are the financial measures which are being contemplated, certainly which have been enacted by the Americans. And you'll notice that the European Union today did precisely nothing on the sanctions front. The entire thing was a damn squib. Maybe they're trying to pressure the French to not sell the second Mistral cruiser, and the French are resisting. This is basically, they're looking for a fig leaf to please their masters in Washington, and the fig leaf is going to be pretty small. Now, what is very significant is I have just done a major Russian banking conference in St. Petersburg, and we had quite a few Chinese speakers. Most of the Chinese banks were involved. And in a way, the current crisis is a challenge, it is a threat to Russia, but it is also a fantastic opportunity. Because if Russia wants to have an independent foreign policy, and to protect its own interest, it must render itself independent of the threat of economic blackmail from countries in the dollar bloc. And talking about isolating Russia is laughable.
Okay,
Russia shares
we're almost out of time here, Eric. I have to go to Eric in New York. Eric, I agree with your last comment, is that, you know, the U.S. State Department, particularly Victoria Nuland, has stumbled all the way through this crisis. What's going to stop them from stumbling?
Well, the only thing that's going to stop them is the political calculation that it's a no-win situation for them. And unfortunately, as it stands right now, they haven't come to that realization. And I think that there's got to be a political price for them to pay. And to some degree, I think Obama and the Democrats are going to pay a price for this. Unfortunately, in the wrong sort of way, because right-wing Republicans will say that they were weak and not aggressive enough, which is complete absurdity. Yeah. And so, unfortunately, I think that as we go into 2014 midterm elections and then 2016 presidential elections, there will be a fallout for U.S. policy, for Obama administration policy in Eastern Europe.
All righty, gentlemen, I wish we had more time, but we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Cleveland, New York, and here in Moscow. And thanks to